go. So. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another ROM Zoom conversation. We are Boyan and Rachel Ruvarec, and Boyan is the director of ROM. You want to say what ROM is?
ROM, I think everybody knows. ROM is a Renewing Our Minds program that exists for
Posterity, Boyan. This is going
20
on
years. That's true. 20 years, and ask us more directly.
So here with us this evening, we have Alan Cutting from the UK. I met Alan about 10 years ago, probably 11, 12, something like that, when I was living in Ukraine and working for an organization called Mission Eurasia. And Alan at the time was working for Samaritan's Purse UK. And together we were kind of overseeing a project reaching out to people with HIV and AIDS in Ukraine, kind of equipping churches to reach out to people in their communities and help them in a holistic way. And so there I spent a lot of time driving around the country with Alan and heard about his kind of philosophy of how churches and others who want to reach out to their community and bring about change and see transformation in their communities, how that can best be done. And so when we're thinking about topics that were relevant to the ROM community, because we know so many of us have a heart to see our communities changed and transformed, but sometimes it's hard to know the best way to go about doing that. So we thought that this would be a really relevant topic for us, and that Alan is a great person to do it. So I'll let Alan maybe say a little bit more about himself and then start. So go ahead, Alan.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Good evening from the UK, good morning, depending where we're speaking or listening from. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you very, very much indeed. Yes, I'm Alan Cutting. I live in the UK. I've worked for 15 years with Samaritan's Purse, during which time made numerous trips to, I think, all of the countries in the Balkans, and might even have met one or two of you on those visits. I was often there to support churches and other community agencies in the effective distribution of Operation Christmas Child, the gift box program, and more recently was in the region for the 2014 emergency flood response and 2015 for the migrant crisis. And these days I am what I guess you could call a church and community consultant, public speaker, and author, or in other words, I'm retired, but happily married to my Azerbaijani wife, hence the flag that you can see behind me. And between us, we have 4 children and 3 grandchildren. Been a follower of Jesus since I was a boy, enjoy international travel and watching live football matches, hence the travel books behind me and the football scarf over here. So for the most of the last decade, I managed a program called Raising Families, which was, it still is, what is often called a church and community transformation program. And in it, we sought to envision and to mobilize small churches to support and equip and mentor the poorest and most vulnerable, most marginalized families in their neighborhoods. And these churches included Catholic and Anglican and Orthodox church groups and some community-based parachurch agencies, but were mainly small non-conformist churches and informal home groups. So after some training, activists from these churches would form what was called a church action group. And they would commit for 3 years to working alongside 20 of the very poorest families in their village or their neighborhood, of all faiths and none. And they would walk with these families as they journeyed out of their ultra poverty, not just spiritually, but also physically and emotionally, socially, societally. And their work was very practical, but it also sought to address the often crippling poverty caused by broken relationships. In other words, relationships with God, with themselves, with others, and with the environment. If I share the screen for a moment, that's coming across. So in this way, between 2012 and 2018, the programme envisioned and mobilised just over 3,000 churches to work with just under 60,000 families. And the vast majority, almost all of these families, saw significant, practical, quantifiable improvements to their lives. Sicknesses averted, children in school, skills learned, crops in the field, food on the table. And then 14,700 people reportedly came into a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And the program functioned mainly in rural areas of 5 lower middle and low income countries in sub-Saharan Africa and in Central Asia. So you might ask, well, what has this all got to do with the upper middle income and more urbanized countries of Europe? Well, we also did a lot of training on it in Belarus and Ukraine, as Rachel has mentioned, and worked with local church and community leaders on contextualizing the program for development in these nations. And we had good discussions as well on its potential effectiveness with church and community leaders in Azerbaijan and in Serbia. And I'm presently working with a church in my own hometown in the UK in a very similar way. So although the contexts and therefore the outworking of the processes are vastly different to those in Africa and to some degree to those in Central Asia, the principles and the values that underpin church and community transformation, well, they're really the same. So just a few other caveats or clarifications regarding contextualization. The program worked well across all age groups. It served families of all faiths and none. The criterion was purely the extent of the family's vulnerability. And although we see the family as one of the most fundamental building blocks of society, maybe to say households it's possibly a better description of the unit that we worked in. So, for example, a homeless person or an elderly widow living alone could equally, and very often was, loved and gathered up in this program. And so this evening, if you're not connected closely to your family or to a church group or are of another faith or none, then please be patient with me. I think you'll find that many of these principles learned whilst working with church groups would aid good community development in other contexts as well. So all that by way of introduction. As we listened to church leaders from various different cultures, it became abundantly clear that many of them were finding it more and more difficult to make meaningful connections with their neighbours. And we're in danger of becoming some sort of inward-looking, self-satisfying Duhovny ghetto, rather than what Jesus taught his followers to be. In other words, salt and light to those around us. The salt was still salt, but somehow it lost its saltiness. The lamps were still lit, but somehow they'd become hidden under a bowl. So very graciously, many church and community leaders offered us the opportunity to undertake what we called an envisioning process. We weren't there to tell people how to worship or to direct the fine nuances of their doctrines and theology or their church etiquette or leadership styles. We merely offered support in helping them make better connections with their neighbours. And we had some excellent, often robust conversations together as they reflected on whether or not they wanted to invest into what we were suggesting as an emphasis or a modus operandi. And maybe 10, 15% said, well, thank you, but we don't feel that that's for us. But for the 85, 90% that did, it often required a significant repositioning of the way they spent their time and their resources, what they would teach or preach about on a Sunday, and how they would do church. However, the outcome was almost always an improvement in the relevance and the impact that they had on their village or their neighborhood for the sake of the gospel. And it's a few of those fundamental principles or values that I would very briefly like to share with you today for your consideration. So, Raising Families, that was the name of the program, encourages churches along the following practical spectrum or line or shift and trajectory continua. And the first one is this: from moving from being buildings-based to community-based. John's Gospel says of Jesus, the Word, that's Jesus, became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. Fabulous image, isn't it? Imagine two people talking outside the supermarket. Hey, have you heard who's moved into that empty apartment just across the road on the second floor? It's Jesus. And then he himself said that as the Father has sent him into the world, so he sends his followers or his disciples into the world. His intention, in other words, is that the church moves into the neighborhood. And he also said, I've come that you might have life and might have it more abundantly. But, sadly, when we look at the way many churches function, one would think he'd said that he'd come that we might have meetings and might have them more abundantly. We've somehow become thin. We've become satisfied with the concept of merely trying to grow a church, by which we mean more people coming to its meetings and assuming that its influence will be expressed almost exclusively through its gatherings and its buildings, into which enormous amounts of energy and resources are spent. So the church is quite good at saying, come to this, come to that, bring your children, you're welcome. And of course, there is a really credible place for this. We often call that the attractional model. But it's all on our terms. It's in our comfort zone and under our control. It all takes place in an environment where we know how to behave, but others don't. And the Great Commission of Jesus said, go into all the world and disciple. But the church has settled for a safer option very often and says, come. Maybe we've forgotten that the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah said, seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And I always remember after the Raising Families Envisioning Process in Kyrgyzstan, one pastor told me, I used to have a vision for a bigger church. Now I have a vision for a better community. And have a think about that. It's quite a statement. It may raise some questions in your mind. But that was the first point. It was moving from being buildings-based through somewhere along the spectrum to becoming community-based, moving, if you like, from those who invite to those who go. Okay, then the second one was this, moving along this continuum from thinking dualistically or in parallel into thinking holistically, a word I noticed Rachel used in her introduction again. So I understand some churches only feel called and are only committed to preaching and praying, and they really do serve their community in that way, and I sincerely respect them for it. However, in doing that, it seems to me that many have somehow separated the spiritual world from the physical material world. And some even feel that social action is almost dangerous and a diversion for the church. And should they encounter those in need, would send them to the social services or to other agencies. I'm sorry, it's just not what we do. Whereas others see the role of the church in almost opposite terms. We're not here to preach, but to serve. Basically, to just be another voluntary social service. And somewhere along the line, as secularism has crept in and taken over, and their cutting edge has been lost. And as a result, such churches have become reticent to talk, for example, about sin and its consequences, or to proclaim the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ, for fear of being perceived as exclusive or arrogant or bigoted or something phobic. And they've become unwilling to rock the boat to political correctness, current social acceptability, if you like. Instead of leaving proclamation of the gospel, really they're leaving that to, what should we say, a few brave experts or weird eccentrics, who we might call it, evangelists. Therefore, our engagement with society individually and as churches, followers of Jesus can very easily fall into one or two errors. Either we become disengaged or we become conformed. And when we become disengaged, we're neither in the world nor of it. We become so separate from the culture that we embrace a language and a lifestyle of our own and do not engage comfortably with those around us. And rather than being the hospital and school or army that it's meant to be, church for us eventually merely becomes a members-only club. However, when we become conformed, we are both in the world and of it. We are so determined to engage with society that we become conformed to its values and become indistinguishable from the people we're seeking to reach. We become so absorbed by the culture that we become identified by it and lose our distinctiveness and prophetic edge. And rather than the worship, discipleship and mentoring environment that it's meant to be, church for us eventually becomes an irrelevance. So doing justice, social righteousness, if you like, it's the public task of the church in society, but it's important that we do it in a way that's relevant and appropriate and purposeful and compassionate and prophetic. So, if you like, there's become a divide between evangelism and social action. And Luke chapter 4, some of the verses there became one of our most used scriptures when training people on what is often called integral mission. When Jesus opened the scroll, basically he said to those listening that his loving Heavenly Father is interested in every aspect of every person's life, be it physically or practically, if you like, addressing issues of health and wealth or of livelihoods, spiritually, helping people to press into a deeper personal relationship with God, emotionally, helping people to come to a place of peace within their own identity and personality, and socially, helping people find peace in their meaningful relationships, their work, family, neighborhood relationships, and societally, helping people to access a place of justice and respect in the broader community. So integral mission, it's the seamless cohesion of the proclamation, the demonstration, and the manifestation of the gospel, words, works, and wonders working in harmony together. And it also involves different gifts and talents working together as one. One of the families that Jesus loved being with was that of the siblings, Martha and Lazarus and Mary. And I have a feeling I know one of the reasons why. In them, we see different gifts being expressed in quite different ways, and their home life harmoniously spilling out into the community, welcoming not only their friends, but also embracing even their critics. Martha served, Lazarus networked, and Mary worshipped. Martha worked like she didn't need the money. Lazarus loved like he'd never been hurt. And Mary danced like no one was watching. And together they were a great model of what Jesus was teaching about the holistic or the integral nature of his Father's love. And the organization Micah Challenge puts it this way: if we ignore the world, we betray the word of God, which sends us out to serve the world. If we ignore the word of God, we have nothing to bring to the world. So justice and justification by faith, worship and political action, spiritual, material, personal change, structural change belong together, as in the life of Jesus, being, doing, and saying are at the heart of our integral task. So that was the second one, moving along this continuum from thinking dualistically or in parallel to thinking holistically, moving, if you like, from a fragmented to an integral approach to mission. Maybe just one more, and that would be this: moving from an aid or charity focus into more of a development or discipleship focus. We found that when a church did engage practically with their community, it was almost always aid or charity focused. It involved handouts or relief, if you like. It did things for people and it gave things to people. And again, there is a place and a time for this, most definitely. But there is a sense in which the giver can say, well, simple really, job done. And somehow it satisfies our need to give, to feel loved, to feel useful. But it doesn't begin to address issues of dignity or of choice or self-determination or respect, but rather has the tendency of building dependency and shame. Give a man a fish, lived in a tiny apartment with his wife and children and with his very demanding mother-in-law. And he would say, give a man a fish and you'll feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you won't see him again till Monday morning. But there's a guy called Robert Lupton, you've probably possibly come across in his book, Toxic Charity. Well, he has a far more sobering quote. And he says this: give once and you elicit appreciation. Give twice and you elicit anticipation. Give 3 times and you elicit expectation. Give 4 times and you elicit entitlement. And give 5 times and you have created dependency. And you can see it, can't you? You know, you turn up with your food package, knock on the door first week. Wow, great appreciation. Thank you so much. And then next Friday night, you turn up, you knock on the door and I wonder what's in their hand. Third week, you knock on the door, Friday night, you know, and well, you know what's going to be in their hand. And there's an expectation. Fourth week, you knock on the door with your food package, maybe a few minutes late, and there's all a wonder where they are. It should be here by now. And give 5 times, and basically you've created dependency. So moving from an aid approach to a development approach, it's a massive challenge for the church. It does take a lot of time and the learning of new skills. And it involves moving from being controllers into being enablers. And I would suggest that too often the attitude of the church has been, we know how you need to live. We would never say this, but the impression is that we are happy to reach out to you as long as we maintain control of the agenda. And I just wonder how different it would be if, within the confines of the gospel, the church learned to address the felt needs of the community rather than what the church itself thinks is best for it. This takes obviously a lot of listening and genuine asking of many questions. I love the questions that Jesus asked. You know, in the Gospels, there's 173 of them. Who touched me? Who do you say that I am? What do you want me to do for you? Do you want to get well? And by this, he gave away the agenda. And it also meant that people had to think for themselves and become responsible for themselves, to grow up and become masters of their own destiny. Not so that people become independent, which I believe is really the goal of a broken and isolated society, but that people become healthily interdependent, which I believe is much more like God's plan for our communities. And as I've got older and older, I increasingly see the need for leaders not to settle for merely being doers, but actually to become enablers, those who equip others for the work of service. And Apostle Paul talked a lot about that in Ephesians chapter 4. But it's about giving the power away. And this is exactly what Jesus did on the cross, wasn't it? He entrusted himself into his Father's hands. He gave himself away for the sake of a much higher goal. And having this approach in our neighborhoods, well, obviously it involves becoming known, being prepared to become vulnerable, or genuinely recognizing that we are an intrinsic part of the brokenness of our own society. But this is really disarming, and I believe in the end it's much more attractive and a humble and genuine approach. So there we have the third one, moving from being aid or charity focused into becoming development or discipleship focused. So those are the three that we've talked about. If I put them on the screen there, if you're seeing it, from being buildings-based to community-based, from thinking dualistically into thinking holistically, from being aid or charity focused into being more development and discipleship focused. I mean, we could have also looked at moving from a programmatic or a project approach to a more relational, process-driven approach. We could have looked at moving from releasing individual activists, of which virtually every church has one, to equipping teams of activists, or similarly turning individual churches and their efforts into networks of churches so that there's one church visible in the neighborhood. We could look also at moving from being needs focused into asset focused. What has the community already got and how can we maximize on that? So, each of those headings really needs a chapter or a book or a session or a conference on their own as we unpack them and argue over them and tussle with their implications. But I trust that this ever so slightly opens a door into a vision for your community and the possibility of the local church, simple, godly, well-meaning amateurs like you and me, to impact it, even transform it to God's glory and for the sake of his kingdom.
Oh, so that's the end of your official talk, Alan? Okay, thank you. Thank you. That was, just like you said, that was basically just a taste, like to whet our appetites for this topic. There's so much more that can be said and so many questions. We have one question from Liviu and Camilla, which we can start with. They ask, how can we empower, inspire, or even make someone who is used to receiving for free take part in action which would teach them to become self-sufficient or to fish? Did you get that? It's in the chat if you want to.
I did. I'm saying it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, an excellent, really challenging question. I think really by the whole session tonight, I'm saying if we start from a position of awareness of these things, then it will probably influence how we approach almost every conversation. It will be in the back of our minds because it somehow seeped into our value system. This little flag that says, I'm just going to be a little bit careful here about the handout mentality. And even if I do, and as we say, there's a very credible place for it, sometimes I've said, I think probably we have a 80-20 approach to aid and development. 80% of the time we think of handouts, or, in the UK, it's often food banks or, night shelters and probably very necessary things. But if all the while we can be turning our own mentality into thinking, how can I make this more developmental? How can I become an equipper? Then I think we will have probably more challenging conversations with people who have learned the culture of receiving handouts. But it's obviously only going to come through relationship, through trust. And I think it's probably a slow journey. There's a sort of a repair job that's got to be done in all of our minds and our thinking. But I would encourage just that mindset to seep into us more deeply, so that it does influence the decisions we make and the conversations we have.
Thank you. I think Peter wrote a question, but maybe Peter, you want to ask it yourself and also introduce yourself because of, let Alan know a little bit about your background.
Yes, good evening all. First and foremost, big thank you to the organizers for sharing the invitation. I'm Hungarian by origin and Dutch by emotion, married to a Dutch lady living in Belgium, but very recently serving the Dutch leg of the International Leprosy Mission, focusing on development projects and disability inclusion in Central African countries in the very near future. And Elaine, thank you again for your great ideas and insights. I was wondering, when you touch upon the differentiation between the relational approach and the programmatic / project approach, also when it comes to development projects implemented or subsidized by governments, all over and over again, I hear the term programmatic approach and project management in development cooperation. So could you please just a little bit more elaborate on the distinctive characteristics? What is the difference in terms of definition between a programmatic approach and the relational one? And cannot they coincide in one way or another? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It's an excellent question. I'm really glad you raised it, because I think although it's probably just one of the ones I didn't touch on this evening, I think to bear in mind the context in which I'm talking about small, often rural, local churches. And the last thing I wanted to do is turn them into an NGO. And yet I think they often felt either dependent on NGOs, or that their activists had to go outside of the context of their church and work for NGOs. And so more of a project mentality would come. Now, I know, depending on the effectiveness and the way that different NGOs would operate, there are different approaches to this, but I would start from this point of saying, maybe it's purely my interpretation of what a project is, but when people talked about raising families, the program I'm talking about, as a project, I would, it seemed too clinical to me. It seemed, it has a beginning, it has an end, we plug in, like a logical framework. We do these activities and these will be the results. And somehow I could see that projects can be completed very successfully like that, and some good can come out of them, and a lot of good can come out of them, but they still have that clunkiness. Is that maybe an English word? I don't know, but too boxy. Whereas there's something about working with the local church. They are the here today, here tomorrow people. They will be around. They bleed the community. They love it. So there's something messier at the edges about the opportunity they have to work, if you like, again, more cohesively or intrinsically with their communities. So I quite liked the fuzzy edges, which said it really is more about relationships. So if we've done these activities and it hasn't quite worked out for you, hey, we're not going to go away. So we learned a lot from project management and a programmatic approach. And indeed, it was a program that was funded to work within parameters. But I was always much more comfortable with the concept of it being a process, in that it was journeying with people and it had the messiness of those edges. But I do agree with you. I think very much so. The best of relationships and the best of programmatic approach comes together and makes for a very wholesome meal. So if we can achieve that balance, then I believe we've done well.
Thank you. I have a question, and after this, you all can be thinking if you have more questions. There's still a little bit of time. You mentioned how sometimes how the church shouldn't be focusing on what they think is best for the community, but they should be listening to the community's felt needs. Can you share an example of when those were different, like when maybe a church or an organization went in with the idea this is what the community really needs, and then they asked the community and it was something completely different?
Yeah, let's see. I mean, it happened so many times. The process of doing that was really to, as we say, to go and to listen to the community. I recall one place where they looked for the poorest people in the community and actually realized that those who were most vulnerable weren't necessarily the most physically poor in that fairly large village. And so their interpretation of the 20 families that they were going to commit to extraordinarily included the local mayor and his family. On what basis? When they listened, they realized that they interpreted anyway, the most pain in that community was the fact that the physically and mentally disabled children were so marginalized that they were locked away in their homes. No one ever saw them. And there was a huge sense of shame, sadly, from an external environmental disaster that had happened in that community. So it really wasn't their fault, even though their culture was of honor and shame. So that just compounded an external problem. And so their interpretation was to commit to those 20 families, even though one of them was the mayor's family. So they developed a day center program, work opportunities for the mothers who previously had not been able to get out, so they'd lost any life skills that they'd learned in younger years. And it was a beautiful example, but a surprising one to us, not one that we'd anticipated when looking. And that came from them not just knowing, but listening to various members of their community with an open heart.
We're unmuted. Sorry. Rick asked about the book that you mentioned, and I think it's Toxic Charity by Robert Lupton. Is that the one?
That's the one.
You quoted?
Yeah,
I'll write it in the chat for you, Rick, also.
Yeah, it's a tough read, to be honest. And personally, I find some of his writing just a little bit cynical, but I trust his heart, and he's a punchy sort of guy that says some punchy things that are very necessary for us to hear. I think I've got some little soft edges, which makes it hard for me to accept some of them. But yeah, so very, very good stuff. Just my own plug, and I'm not sure if you can access Amazon or whether you like to access Amazon, but I've written about raising families as well. And if you were to put my name into Amazon Books, you can find that as well if you were interested. But yeah, Robert Lupton, Toxic Charity.
Yes, Alan's written 2 books, or maybe 3 now.
Yeah, 3.
And I read Cutting Across Borders, right? But Raising Families is on my desk right now. It's at the top of my to-read list, but I haven't read it yet.
It's Gathering Dust, is it, Rachel? Yeah.
Gathering Dust.
Jack has a question. Jack, you want to ask it yourself, or should I read it for you?
Hello, Alan. I'm going to use a British voice that you'll recognize. First of all, I'm really delighted that you're talking about process, because I think so often churches are focused on events, on happenings, and it's just great. And sadly, one of the things that was the case about 20 years ago, and of course, I'm not going to guess your age because you're much younger than me, but 20, 30 years ago, right across industry and commerce and in churches, process management was actually taught as a discipline. We don't do that much anymore because the fashions, managerial fashions have changed. But it is a difficulty that those understandings are not around in the way that they used to be. So I'm pleased about the process. But my real question is, when you go and talk to a church somewhere or a group somewhere, how long does it take them, do you find, for them to listen to you and for them to listen to their community before they start to find a new set of purposes?
You've got a good bunch of people here, Brian and Rachel. I love the questions. Thank you, Jack. I smile because it depended very much on context. So you heard that some of this was in Central Asia and some of the former Soviet countries. And Central Asia, actually particularly, trust was a massive issue. And there's a dominance and a strength that comes from leadership, culturally and rightly so for the culture. But so we would deliberately give 6 to 9 months in that culture for winning hearts, for walking with, for listening to, for dialogue, for drinking tea, all the things that one has to do in that culture to build trust. Whereas sometimes in sub-Saharan Africa, we had to slow down for our sake because we didn't want people to latch on to things thinking, great, we plug into the program and at the end there'll be something that comes out of it, which obviously, as you can hear, is the opposite of what we were seeking to do. So I think that was replicated in the church's own communities as well. And again, that was in a sense the tension between program and relationship, in that there were people behind me who were saying, are we up to where we thought we would be up to? Sometimes we were racing ahead of that, and sometimes we were a little bit behind it. But it did depend very, very much on the context. But it's vital. And the other aspect of that was worked with something like 800 churches once and another 500, 1,300 churches in the Rwandan Anglican diocese province of Anglican province of Rwanda. As you possibly know, that's a very hierarchical society, and the church has that hierarchical approach to things. It's an amazing country. Those of you who've been there or worked there will know that. There's no litter on the streets, and you do what you're told. And to have the Archbishop of Rwanda being passionately behind this program was great for us, because basically there was a real sense of, you know, of good tucked in submission to leadership there, which, because he was behind the program, that gave us a great start to do some great things in Rwanda.
Okay, if I can just make a comment, a church that I'm involved with in North Carolina, we're working with a group of churches, and including synagogues and well, all faiths basically. But we're actually working with a thing called the Industrial Areas Foundation. I don't know if you've heard of it. No, and it basically, it's a community development, community action program. And the comment is, it's probably taken us about 2 years to have enough conversations for them to choose what they want to work on as a community. And they've chosen, this is in Raleigh in North Carolina, and they've chosen to work on education and to work on housing. And now we're started in the program, probably a year into the program, and beginning to meet the political hurdles that are inevitably going to come, because these are political things. But I was only just meaning 3 years of fairly substantial peddling to get this far.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we probably in the West make things a little bit more complicated for ourselves, don't we? Or there's more hoops to jump through, as you say, with, you know, be it things legal or, you know, the requirement to raise large amounts of capital and for that to be accountable, etc. So I do appreciate that the context I'm talking about probably works best in low and lower middle income countries. And it does become more challenging because of the need for capital to see so much change. I think that's, in a sense, I hope I didn't hide behind merely the principles, but I think it's really valuable to do that. But to find the context for our own cultures and societies, it is a big challenge and will take a lot of time.
Thank you.
Oh,
there we go. I think we have time for maybe one more question or comment if someone wants to jump in. There have been a couple comments in the chat that, you know, if people want to make them out loud, you can. Or if someone else has a question.
Maybe just a practical one for any future consultancy or support, if we have any question. I mean, is there any possibility to get in touch with you, Ellen, or maybe just to receive some professional advice, especially in terms of our projects being implemented in the future in Africa among people with disabilities? Maybe I just wonder, maybe it would be great to have any feedback later in one way or another from you. Just keep in touch. Is it possible? Are you available for any future interactions?
I'm hugely honoured, sir. I would very happily do. As you heard, you know, I'm not over busy right now. There's enough to do, but you know, we have to learn what retirement is. But I love every opportunity to, again, to listen, to share, to pray with, whatever is appropriate. So I don't know, Boy and Rachel, if you want to forward an email address, or you can got that website as well, cuttingacross.com, and there's a contact page in there as well. Really happy to engage further if you feel that I can be of some help and support.
I was just going to suggest, Peter, you can go to his website and then just follow the.
Or we can do an introductory
Or if you
email,
want, we can do the introductory email to
remind us, you know, email us or write us a message on Facebook or something if we if you're having trouble getting hold of Alan. Yeah. Or
Thank you very kindly.
Yeah.
I can tell you, Alan, if you're just retiring, you better get ready to get busy.
It's actually been about a year and a half, and yeah, it's been a strange year and a half, of course, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Alan. I think that we're going to end this right almost on the dot at an hour. But like Alan just said, you guys can get in touch with him, and COVID willing, we hope that Alan will be joining us at ROM this summer in Croatia. So a few of you might see him there. And yes, thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope to see you online again soon. Stay tuned for more events. Good night, everyone.